My next guest has often been a vocal critic of Governor Paterson, arguing that he has not done enough to address the state's fiscal problems, and also he thinks that Paterson's op-ed calling for pension reform in this morning's Daily News missed the mark. E.J. McMahon is the director of the Empire Center on New York State Policy, and he is joining me in the studio tonight. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And Happy New Year to you.
Same to you.
So you think this is late to the table and a little bit puzzling, actually, as the governor is out the door?
Well, it kind of begs the question, where have you been? I think somebody in the governor's office, maybe the governor himself, were kind of thinking like Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, you know, warning of the military-industrial complex.
Right.
Except the difference is, aside from the really obvious ones, is that Eisenhower was a really credible guy talking about something he knew about that he had been resisting for 8 years. David Paterson is talking about a subject that it's not clear he knows that much about, on which he's actually contributed to the problem on balance in New York State. If he had come out and said, you know what, I blew it. We needed to do more, and let me tell you what I've learned and what we need to do specifically. Instead, if you actually look at what he said in this piece, he says he becomes like the 4,000th person to jump on top of the pile and say, we've got a pension crisis. Well, welcome to the fray. And
right.
Then he says, and then when he's describing what ought to be done about it, it's basically kind of political double talk. He doesn't actually have a prescription. He says, this is tough, everybody must come to the table, and there has to be shared sacrifice.
Well, none of what we have actually discussed on numerous occasions right here at this very table is mentioned here. We don't talk about how you might actually have retirees contributing, for example, in the future. You don't talk about what might happen about opening, how you would get there. Would you do it by statute? Would you reopen the Constitution? Any of these hard choices that have to be made are not addressed in this op-ed. Well, he didn't have that much room, to be fair, but still.
No, it's a short format, but he did he had a fairly long interview on CNBC Squawk Box in the morning. Not a wide audience, but he had a long interview with 3 different guys talking to him about this, and didn't say much more than he said in the op-ed. In fact, it was aimed at a national audience, and by the way, it worked to an extent. I got emails from several people in other states saying, hey, look at your governor. It looks like he's saying something about pension reform. And then I had to point out to them, yeah, but look what he said. And he didn't say anything in particular.
But he did bring up an interesting case study, which is this little teeny town. It's called Pritchard, right?
Pritchard, Alabama.
Which actually went broke. Its pension fund went broke.
Right.
And it is sort of a case study of what would happen if, in fact, the state's pension fund went broke. But you say it's not possible? They're not analogous.
Well, it's possible, but the analogy is it's an extreme. And he, in his interview on TV, he cited Pritchard, which is the story, a subject of some recent news stories. I think the Times had something on it.
They did, yeah.
Pritchard's a poor little town. It had its own pension fund that it was not contributing adequately to. It was not funding it adequately. The town ran out of money, and it basically stopped paying the pensions. They had retired police and municipal workers who are making these little tiny pensions that they stopped paying entirely. Now, that's terrible. There are probably a few score localities around the country out of hundreds that have their own pension funds and many thousands that are part of bigger pension funds that are actually in such bad territory that they're on the brink of going that insolvent.
Right.
Alabama is a poor state that doesn't have the kind of protections against pension diminishment that a state like we do. It's kind of the extreme instance of what Governor Paterson called being a pension insolvency, pension funds that are actually run out of money.
But it can't happen here?
Oh, it could happen here if we didn't fund it, but the point is New York's pension funds, first of all, and the odd thing was he never referred to New York's pension funds in particular. New York's statewide pension funds are, by government standards, which is relative. Government standards are permissive. By government standards, are relatively well funded. By private sector standards, they're underfunded, but not severely underfunded. They need to be better funded. But to keep them even as well funded as they are, the problem is not that they are, quote unquote, on the brink of insolvency. The problem is to keep them as well funded as they are now, even at that level. They're going to double, triple, or quadruple their contributions that we have to make to them.
Well, right, and then as we've seen local elected leaders say here, then we're going to have to choose between giving you fire protection and paying into the pension
So
funds.
It won't be like Pritchard, where like the retired cop actually is not getting his pension anymore, but it's going to be a different kind of problem where the street isn't plowed, the cop is not on the beat, the fire response is not as quick, because you have to keep putting more and more and more money into the pension fund.
But on a scale of things that he might have addressed, we've seen a bunch of pardons actually in the last week and a half from Governor Paterson. We saw a commutation. I just felt that this was interesting. He is, you have to argue, raising the level of the conversation by saying the last thing that I'm going to do publicly in my last op-ed is tell you guys that pensions are a problem. It's just that you argue he had an opportunity to address them and did not.
He had an opportunity, being governor of one of the nation's largest states, at a time of a nationwide fiscal crisis, when there's a growing recognition from all parties that there is a growing pension crisis. It varies in the nature of the crisis from state to state, but it's a serious problem and it's growing. He had an opportunity to say, hey, let me warn you, and let me tell you what I've learned here. And I think, unfortunately, he blew it. In other words, he saw that opportunity. He thought, I'll get at this issue. But then the way he talked about it was, frankly, he talked about it like a guy running for office, which is sort of all over the place and trying to give the impression of somebody being stern and responsible without actually pointing us in any direction.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we're going to be talking about this issue, I think, a lot with you going forward, and I know that incoming Governor Andrew Cuomo has this on his radar screen. It's just unclear where in the whole pantheon of things that he has to address he's going to be addressing this, but I have a feeling it's probably on the radar screen. So
I think you're right.
I want to thank you very much, E.J. McMahon, for joining us,
You're
and
welcome.
again, Happy New Year.
Same to you.